Hello and welcome to AccessJet. I'm here today with Deborah and Antonio. We are just recording a short one, and really it's a reflection on some of the events that we've been to over the last couple of weeks. Because although there have been accessibility-centric events, we've just had Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Actually, for me, and I think from the conversation I just had with Antonio before we came online, some of the richest conversations and the most stimulating ideas have actually come from events where accessibility hasn't been the main factor in the event. So I went to an event in Barcelona called Fair Cultures, which was looking at a range of topics from DEI to regulations to lobbying. And what it did was it brought together a mixture of technology, people that were thinking about policy, people that were implementing different programs and looking at how we can create a culture of fairness and equity, but also trying to understand the new world that we're operating in now. And actually, it's multiple worlds that we're operating in now, because you've got the world that has been turned on its head, if you like, in North America with the changes in attitudes towards diversity, equity, and inclusion that have been really politically driven. And then you've got the counterbalance to that that's going on in Europe, where there was actually discussions about how you might accelerate and defend what you might consider European values. And as a Brit who considers himself still to be European, that was of interest to me. And I was really very interested by the sort of whole idea of lobbying and transparency. So one of the most interesting talks for me was a professor at one of the big business schools that also runs something called Good Lobby. And this was really looking at corporate transparency and really mapping what organizations do versus what they say. And this was really interesting to me because organizations spend a lot of time talking about what they want, positioning themselves to be sustainable, inclusive, and all of these things. But they also belong to trade bodies and different organizations. And when you start looking at what those organizations that they put money into are asking for, quite often they're at odds with the stated aims of the organizations. So what this particular organization is doing is building a map of this and helping people to understand the complexity of what organizations are doing, and also understanding the complexity that within a single organization you've got divergent views. So you may have a statement on accessibility from the accessibility people and a statement on diversity and inclusion from the HR team or whoever's responsible, another one on CSR, but they may be at odds with each other. And I think that this plays in very nicely to some of the talks that we've had recently, which is, why is it so hard to make progress on accessibility, disability inclusion? Why is it that when we make statements of intent, when we have, C-level buy-in, that it's still hard to do this stuff? And I think that some of that is because organizations are diverse and they have different needs and different priorities within those same organizations. So for me, this was really a fascinating topic. There were lots of other great speakers as well, but I thought that those organizational dynamics and the idea of transparency and mapping and reporting are topics that are going to come more and more to the forefront, certainly in the EU over the next coming years. And I know, Antonio, you were also at a conference and were looking at different intersections.
Yes, at the Siemens AI Summit, there was a track on people and culture, and there were a few examples focused out to make sure that we create and adjust technology to the needs of people, and it was particularly focused on prosthetics. How can prosthetics be adjusted to the needs of the person? Sometimes when people go into that journey, they have different questions. They don't know. A parent can ask, will I be able to carry my daughter in the arms? Would I be able to run? Other people might have questions. Will I be able to practice sports? And they were trying to find ways where they can answer to those questions and use AI to adjust prosthetics to the needs of each individual, based on their age and based on their profile. And the fact that you are able to talk about this, the fact that you're able to talk about this at an event on AI that is not about accessibility, it actually connects a lot with the people who often don't attend accessibility conferences. So I think that's one of the best elements. People end up connecting with the fact that users have this type of needs and became more aware that you're able to use AI not just to create a bot, but to do other things.
I'm just a little confused because I don't understand why we would ever be creating anything for, say, a prosthetic and we were not considering the person we were creating it for. So I just find the conversations at a lot of these conferences very interesting right now. I also think this is certainly not just about big corporations, which neither one of you were saying, but I'm also hopeful. I have not attended any of those types of conversations or conferences lately, sort of deliberately, but I was recently speaking at the World Congress, the World Vaccine Congress. But I just think that one thing that I'm hopeful about, I'm glad that big corporate brands are starting to figure out that you got to really, really consider personalization. And I know people already were, but it's just, don't y'all think that sounds weird that it's like, oh, and they're figuring out we really need to make sure prosthetics, for example, are being personalized. So I think a lot of this confusion that we're experiencing as a world maybe is adding to these conversations in a way that makes them more valuable for human beings. So I think it's so interesting because I've gone to so many accessibility conferences and I don't really find them that valuable for me, just where I am in my life. But I think the accessibility conferences are valuable to a lot of people. But at the same time, I think the conversations have to shift and change. And I know, Neil, you just had a conversation with Steve Tyler that Antonio and I couldn't join, where he was talking about, y'all were both talking about sort of some accidental findings of accessibility, and I know with GAD, we have a lot that we can celebrate, but I still think a lot of the conversations that I hear happening right now with a lot of brands, they're very interesting and a little bit confusing because I think people are trying to figure out how do we do our job despite all this stuff? How do we have better impacts? What are the right ways to go? I think it's a really good time for our community. I really do.
So it was interesting because I thought we were going to talk about accidental accessibility, and actually, what it was unexpected accessibility because clearly the companies that have provided the products to Steve were very intentional. So
Right.
he said that his new router turned up and it had Braille on all of the Ethernet ports and all of this kind of
Right.
stuff. So that doesn't happen by accident. Neither does an app that works out that you're using assistive tech. That's intentional. But what it is it's coming in maybe areas that have been unexpected before, maybe because we've spent too long expecting the accessibility not to be good, so that when companies actually do it, it comes as a surprise rather than an expectation. But it was interesting to see that. And we also talked about the idea of peer normativity. Now, that's a slightly academic term. It was coined for accessibility by Kevin Kerry, who was chair of the RNIB, friend of mine, and has been on AccessJet a few years back. And the idea is that that not everybody has necessarily exactly the same experience, but that you should have the equivalent quality of experience as your peers who don't have a disability. So if everybody's experience sucks, it's equal treatment if your experience sucks too, right? That's peer normative equivalence of experience. But if the average user, the non-disabled user's experience is fantastic, then we should expect as users of assistive tech that we have an equally fantastic experience, even if it is a different one. And so I think that sometimes we get hung up about the idea that you can make one app that's going to work perfectly for everyone, right? And sometimes that's not possible because you've got all of these different needs. And that harks back to the conversation we had a couple of weeks back with Tristan Lavender, where we're talking about cognitive accessibility, and there the needs don't meet, and sometimes you have to meet in the middle. So I think that sometimes we actually have to think about what the intent is, right, and whether it's compliance or it's delivering quality experiences for people. And I think that what Antonio was getting at was not that we don't understand that different people have different needs, but that by using AI, you can probably deliver that personalization more quickly and better. And you're bringing people that were not in the disability field, but coming to it through the application of AI and waking them up to thinking about this. And that's what's exciting about going.
And AI allows you to do things that you could not do before.
I know. I love AI. Please don't take it away from me. I use it so much. I really, really, and it's making me think differently. And I don't always believe everything I get from my AI, but I find it very valuable. But it's just interesting watching it unfold because, with accessibility, we're still a small team comparatively around the world. But it's like we need everybody going into conferences that aren't accessibility and, helping them understand, like once again, the vaccines. I don't usually go and speak at a vaccine conference, but I was really, really surprised at the amount of healthcare providers that were stepping in going, all right, how do we improve the patient experience? How do we do? And so I'm actually getting a little hopeful about it. And I'm also hopeful, Neil, I'm just going to say this and that I love all of the work that so many big brands have made. I'm so grateful for it. But I also am excited about seeing medium brands and smaller brands get more innovative and join these conversations, whether they're being had with words like accessibility, disability inclusion, whether or not, but that we're actually being more successful making human lives better using technology. Because I do believe in that, and I know that AI can improve it. I also saw that there's some recent, of course, AI and accessibility, some tools coming up specifically for accessibility and AI. And I know there's been some controversy in our community talking about stuff like this, but I do think that's interesting as well, because I don't really care who wins at the end of the day, as long as we make things accessible to the community and society. I'm not as interested in it, one accessibility brand winning over another. I'm more interested in the impact, as I know we all are. That's why we do this show for 11 years. But it is hopeful. I think I'm being a little hopeful lately. What do y'all think?
I swing between being hopeful and despairing. I think that there's really amazing capability tools, and some of the stuff that we're doing with AI is wonderful, but I'm also mindful of the way that some of the companies that own these AI tools have been mining data and how they've not necessarily behaved responsibly. So when we're thinking about the impact on society, some of those things make me feel somewhat uncomfortable. So as we start getting, to sort of using AI agents more, agentic AI being the real buzz right now. And we're really sort of having multiple layered complex AI assistants able to do things on your behalf. You're surrendering huge amounts of your very deeply personal data to these organizations. And that requires a level of trust and security beyond anything that we've seen before. And I don't know the organizations that are asking us to surrender this data have really proven that they can be trusted on some of this stuff.
I don't trust.
I think it's important to everyone who is leading organizations or making decisions in organizations to have a personal perspective and so on these tools. Why is that? Because in the beginning, we all get excited with technology. New thing. And then we go to a curve. And then after, when we have this hand-on and this experience, we start to realize the benefits, and we also try to start to understand the weaknesses and the problems. So we were so excited at the beginning, and then some of that excitement might fade away, or we might say, "Oh, I was really excited with ChatGPT in the beginning, and today ChatGPT is actually not my to-go app to get the best results. I prefer others." So having this hands-on, then have some critical thinking about how all this works is basically really, really important, in order to have a big picture and to apply, to have these views to allow us to make better decisions and use the tools better.
So,
I agree. And I'm just going to say, I just want to say, I'm in love with ChatGPT. I just am absolutely in love with ChatGPT, but I also use several others. But I just really, and so I'm using five others, but I'm going to have to say, I love ChatGPT. I'm having wonderful results. I also think sometimes it's how you're training it yourself and how much I've been talking with ChatGPT for years. So I sometimes just don't know. I don't know everything. All those rich conversations I've had with Chat GPT add value to with the results I get, whereas I don't have that relationship with the five others I'm using. So I sometimes don't know how you build that. That's just me not knowing, but I am very hopeful about what it can do just to improve these conversations so that it's less about compliance, which we've done so aggressively in the United States with accessibility. So I'm actually hopeful with what's happening, especially in Europe.
Yeah,
But back over to you, Neil.
thank you. I'm not beating on AI tools, right? Because I do think that there's a huge amount of utility there and great potential. I just think that there's also lots of unresolved things that we need to look
I
at.
agree.
And, this is where ethicists really need to come in and come to the fore. We need to engage early in this stuff. And this is something that organizations need to be taking seriously. And that was another area that the conference was covering. It was sort of around corporate ethics and stuff like that. So I thought it was a really interesting blend. It sort of started us off thinking about stuff more and about how you might govern around this stuff, and also the sort of impact that organizations are having on society. Final thought before we leave, because we're a short one today, is we're of an older generation. We grew up without the technology. We grew up having to question, having to read, having to do references. What you're being fed now when you're typing stuff into a search window, you get a summary. And so what you don't get is often all of the references and everything else. So we need to be teaching younger generations critical thinking and the ability to question and sort of dig behind the results, because otherwise what you do is you get reinforcement, and you could quite easily end up with people sort of taking everything just as it's presented to them. So that's something that I think we as societies need to be thinking about in terms of how we enable people with the mental tools and the social capacity to be able to use these new technology tools. So with that, I'd like to thank our friends at Amazon and My ClearText for keeping us on air and keeping us captured, and look forward to continuing the conversation on social media.